You're listening to Nutrition Matters Podcast with Paige Smathers, registered dietitian nutritionist. Hey everyone, it's Paige, your favorite nutrition podcaster and dietitian. Nutrition Matters Podcast explores what really matters in nutrition and health with a sensitive and realistic approach. This podcast relies on the support of listeners like you and needs donations to keep this project running. To help support the podcast, please consider making a donation at pagesmothersrd.com/podcast. If you find this episode interesting, engaging, or helpful in your life, please consider donating, sharing with friends and family, and leaving a review on iTunes. You can leave a review about this podcast straight from your podcast app. Search Nutrition Matters Podcast, click Reviews, and then write a review. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook at Paige Smathers RD if you'd like to have a little more food for thought. Thank you for listening. Hey guys, it's Paige. Welcome to another episode of Nutrition Matters Podcast. I'm so glad you're here, as always. And before we get into talking about today's subject and me introducing our guest, I wanted to just have you take a minute to stop the recording, get on iTunes, and leave a review. If you're on your phone and you have an iPhone, you just go into the podcast app, you click on, let's see, I'm going to do it with you right here. You click on search, you search Nutrition Matters, and then once you've done that, you click on the icon with the strawberries, and then you do the middle button there. There's details, reviews, and related. Click on reviews, and then click on write a review. I would love it if you just took 2 minutes to do that. That helps the rankings of the show climb. That helps people find the podcast. That helps me to be able to continue to do this work so that, more people are finding this message, which means that I'm potentially able to make an income off of it. So if you would take a moment to do that, if you found anything that you've listened to on the podcast helpful, that would be one of the best ways to be able to give back, is just leaving a quick review. It's also very, very helpful to me just on like a little bit of a personal level. It's just nice to know that there's people out there who this is helping, and I read every single one of them, and each and every one I read just makes my day. So take a second to do that. Also, if you'd like to join me on my Facebook group to be able to talk about these episodes in more depth and kind of have a little bit more of a little community feel around, to be able to learn more about these issues and to be able to discuss with other people on similar paths, join me there. That's Nutrition Matters Podcast Study Group. Okay, so with that, let's talk about our conversation today. Today, I am talking with Jill Castle, who is a registered dietitian, nutritionist, and she is an expert in childhood nutrition. She has spent the last 25 years of her life dedicating herself to help babies, toddlers, children, and teens, and parents of all of those children to develop a healthy relationship with food. And she's the author of 2 books, but I'm sure there's more. 2 books that I know of one is called Eat Like a Champion, and the next is called Fearless Feeding with Marianne Jacobson, who I actually also interviewed on this podcast. So she is just a joy to talk to. She also, this is another thing I need to tell you, is that she has a podcast, and she's going to tell you about it on the episode today, but it's called The Nourished Child. So if you're really interested in learning more about childhood feeding and feeding dynamics that we're talking about in this episode, you might want to check out her podcast and blog. She has a lot of great free resources available as well. So today on the podcast, Jill and I discuss this idea of different feeding styles that parents have, and really trying to dive into, why do we feed our kids the way that we do? How does the way that we were fed as children affect our own relationship with food and our own way that we feed our kids? And what are the consequences of the different feeding styles? And how do we develop a quote-unquote ideal feeding style with our parenting relationship that we have? And then in the last part of the conversation, we also have a conversation about how to talk to kids about weight. So that was really interesting. I loved her take on that, and I am sure that you'll enjoy it. So with that, let's get on and take a listen. All right. Well, Jill Castle, welcome to Nutrition Matters podcast, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Paige. I'm happy to be on your show.
Yay, me too. So let's get right on into the topic for the day. We want to talk a little bit about the things that you're most excited and passionate about. And you've spent the last 25 or so years of your life dedicating your career and time to helping parents create healthy feeding dynamics for their families and for kids to be raised in homes that are happy and healthy from a mental and a physical perspective. Is that somewhat of a good summary? Do you want to add some more to that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, that's a great summary. I think kids are my passion, and my purpose is to help parents be, the wonderful providers and feeders and connectors that they can be around food and nutrition. So it's not easy in today's world, as you well know.
Yes, it's so true.
It gets harder and harder, it seems. But I've got 4 of my own kids, so those poor 4 kids, they've been my guinea pigs along the way too. So I feel like I have the nutrition expertise, but I also have sort of the parenting and the feeding expertise, to sort of back up what I find works for my clients and what has worked for me.
Yeah, I think it's always a little bit of a weaving in your own personal experience with the research and with working with other people. It's just this nice little molding for each individual of what's going to work best for them,
right,
based on all those things. So let me just ask a really broad question, and then we'll see where this conversation goes. So today we wanted to talk a little bit about feeding dynamics and feeding styles, and kind of how these feeding styles develop in parents, and then how the different styles of feeding affect children. And then one of the big things I want to hit on today too is this idea of how to talk to our kids about weight, because I think that is one of the questions I get a lot from my podcast listeners is like, okay, thanks for all these resources for me as the adult, and thanks for this advice about feeding kids, but what about what do I say? What words can I and can't I say? And for anyone listening who's listened to this podcast for a while, I kind of really try to avoid that black and white thinking where it's like, okay, this is a good way to say it and this is a bad way to say it. We don't want to have super huge rules in our head of what's good and bad and right and wrong around these issues. It really depends on your own family and your own kids and their personalities and your own style. But I want to have a general discussion around that, because it can be really tricky when you become aware of these issues and you become sensitized to them. Then you sort of sometimes feel paralyzed. Well, how do I talk and how do I act if I know that something I might say might really affect my child? So sometimes parents feel really nervous about navigating that. And I think that's reasonable fear that some parents have. So
definitely.
All right. So with that, where do you want to start? What would be a good spot to start with all those topics and themes I have in mind?
Well, yeah, I think the first place to start is probably thinking about, as a parent, sort of what your roots are, what your history is with food and how you were raised. And, on my own podcast, whenever I interview another expert, I always ask, what was your experience like as a child around food and nutrition, particularly in the area of feeding? And everybody has a story, Paige. Everybody has a memory. Many of the memories aren't very positive, to be quite honest. And yet, at the same time, even though they might be a negative memory or a negative feeling, they still come out on top. They still have, they've done okay. So despite, having some things happen in their past with feeding, they've managed to grow up as adults and figure it all out. So I think whenever I'm working with parents, I'm always curious about what their history is. And when I say what's your history around feeding, I'm really interested in how they were raised. So what feeding style was used when they were raised, and what were some of the practices that were happening around food and around mealtime. So we know that there are 4 different feeding styles. There's the authoritarian feeding style, which is sort of the, my way or the highway. If I tell you, you have to sit at the table and eat your food and not leave until it's done, that's the way it's going to play out. That's what's going to happen. Or else. That's the authoritarian feeding style, and it's really more about the parent. It's more centered around the parent's wishes and desires, and less so around the child's food preferences or their own appetite, for example.
You know what's so interesting about that? And I can trace my line back, and I know that my grandma on my mom's side was very much that way. And I could see my mom's feeding style be very much affected by the way her mom fed her. She was somewhat of the opposite. And so it'll be interesting to hear these different other styles, because I think that sometimes we are a reaction to our parents, right? And I think that's sort of where you're going with this. But as people are listening, start thinking back not only to your parents, but maybe even the stories you heard from your parents about how they were fed. And we often sort of react and maybe go to a different extreme sometimes when we're navigating that. So keep going. But I love it so far.
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah. And I will just share myself. I'm the daughter of the oldest daughter of 2 German parents from, my father's heritage is directly from Germany. And I was raised with an authoritarian feeding style, no doubt. I had to sit at the table till I was done eating and the plate was clean. So that being said, I was never punished. It was never a horrible thing for me because I was a good girl. My personality was to be a pleaser and to never break the rules and do everything I was told. So I didn't have a lot of negative association with that as a child, but I do recall and understand that that's sort of my background. But because of that, you mentioned your mother feeding in an opposite way. The next feeding style is called the permissive feeding style, and it is pretty much the opposite of the authoritarian. So it's characterized by being very responsive to a child's wishes and desires, and also not having tons of structure and boundaries around food and eating. So I always say to the families that I'm working with, that's like the yes parent. That's the parent that if your child says he's hungry, even though it's just been a half an hour since he had lunch, the permissive parent will quickly scramble to find something for that child to eat. Or that parent might just really want to please the child in any way she can. And food is an easy way to please the child. So there might not be a lot of structure around sweets and treats and snacking, for example.
I can see how that style would become more pronounced and prominent in situations where there's a divorce or there's a bunch of chaos or maybe working full-time, both parents, we're just like, you're kind of in survival mode around food sometimes. That's interesting. Okay. Sorry, I'm just commenting on each one.
No, that's okay. And definitely for some people who were raised with that authoritarian strong arm way of feeding, they and I've had clients in my practice who have said, listen, this is how I was raised. So there's no way I'm raising my children like
that.
I am going to be much more flexible. They think they're being flexible with food,
right?
But oftentimes they're just they're allowing the child to basically set the parameters around food and eating and all of those things, which is not good either.
So any hint of structure or authoritarian yes or no, or saying no, maybe is scary to someone who's been raised in that way. I could imagine. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. The third style is the neglectful style, and that is really where food and feeding children is not a high priority for the parent. But that can also be a feeding style that's not used because of sort of the history of how they were fed. It could be that it's related to socioeconomic situations. So parents that are working all the time and aren't home to feed their children, or don't have the means to access food. So that neglectful feeding style, what it does is it really comes off to a child as an insecurity around food and mealtime, because that nothing's predictable. And so we know that from the little research in that area is that children might become more focused on food because it's not predictable, regular, and it might not be what they want to eat or enough. So they get nervous. They get a little focused on it, and they get a little nervous around food.
I've seen that that type of feeding style in adults that I've worked with, and sort of how that affects them later. And that's what you just said with the research is consistent with what I've seen many times with people who are raised with that feeding style. And like you said, it's often out of, the parent's control and not intentional, but just kind of the way it goes,
Yeah. And then the last one is called the authoritative feeding style, and that's the positive feeding style. There's 2 T's in it. So I always say there's 2 T's, 2 plus signs. That means it's positive, because parents can get confused with the authoritarian style because it's a similar word. But the authoritative style is the love with limits style. So you love your child, you appreciate his food preferences, you understand his temperament, you respond to his appetite signs, but you also have structure, you have boundaries around food and feeding, but you also allow your child to have a voice in the matter. So you might allow your child to serve himself his own food at dinner time, or you may allow your child to help do the meal planning or select some of the food that's being purchased for the week. So the child has a say in what he eats and that whole dynamic around feeding, but he's not in charge. The parent is still in charge.
Okay, so if I'm kind of a visual person, and even though I podcast, I like to sometimes try to paint a picture. So here's what I'm imagining in my head. Kind of on one end of the spectrum, we have the authoritarian style, and then on the other end, we have the permissive style. And then in the middle, maybe is that authoritative, where there's some situations where you are a bit more, nope, we're not doing that. And then there are other situations where you are a bit more permissive or a bit more collaborative with your child about decisions and about, food preferences and selection and all of that. And maybe the neglectful style, is that how you said it? Neglectful. Maybe that's not really on the spectrum just because it's maybe a bit more related to financial, socioeconomic situation, less related to personalities of the parent. Is that fair?
Right. Yeah.
That's just what I'm imagining.
Yeah. And the funny thing is that pretty much all parents dip their toes into all the different feeding styles, depending on the situation or the circumstances that they're in.
I can see that.
Yeah. I mean, when I'm really busy and traveling, I might not stock the house with food before I leave. I might, just be too busy to do that. Well, that can come off neglectful as a child. So to a child rather. So I think it's important to note that, we can all demonstrate all 4 of these feeding styles, but generally there's one that prevails. And the way that you can tell which one prevails is by the practices that are happening day in and day out. So and this might get a little confusing, and I actually can give you a couple of download handouts
that'd be great.
For you to share that sort of separates these things out. But the authoritarian feeding style, so that controlling feeding style, is what we see for practices like the day-to-day stuff, restricting your child from indulgent foods like sweets or candy or sodas, really having a tight control over those foods. That's consistent with that authoritarian feeding style. Another practice is to reward your child with treats or sweets to get them to eat what you want them to eat. So mostly that's healthy foods like vegetables, or to get them to behave in a certain way. So you want them to be quiet or well behaved at the doctor's office. You promise a sucker when you're done. That is another practice that we can see that tells us that parents' feeding style is more like an authoritarian feeding style.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of the food reward thing.
Yeah, so food reward, food
tricky
restriction.
For a child to understand what that means, and it can become really easy to manipulate, and it kind of gets into some murky waters. Although it's
Definitely.
tricky as a parent because it really does work, right? So it's like sometimes you're just desperate and you're like, stop this huge fit. You're embarrassing me at the doctor's office. Just if you stop, I will give you something
Right.
delicious. Yeah. So I mean, while I'm not a big fan of it, I do have compassion for people. And even for
Definitely.
myself, because sometimes I've found myself doing that. It's just, it's really tricky.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the point is it becomes problematic if it's used a lot. I think that, again, if predominantly you're parenting with that love with limits, and sometimes you're using a reward, or sometimes, all of these different practices are negative in general. If you look at the literature, they're all considered to be negative practices. But part of the trick is that parents don't even recognize they're doing them. And they oftentimes are frustrated with their child, and they think it's, my child won't eat their vegetables, or this, that, or the other. And it really isn't about the vegetables so much as it is about the practices that they're using that are sort of shooting themselves in the foot in terms of getting their child to eat those vegetables. The third practice that's really common too, Paige, is pressure to eat. And pressure to eat is basically reminding, nagging, pushing your child to take another bite, to try a new food, to eat all their food on the plate. That's all pressure. And in children, particularly children who are picky eaters, we know that pressure to eat really backfires. It turns them off. It turns off their appetite, and they don't eat better. They don't eat more. And in children who might struggle with their weight, this pressure to eat can really backfire, because it basically enables them to tune out of their appetite and eat more than their body tells them to eat. So sometimes, you're at a party or you're having a dinner, and the parent is saying you need to clean your plate. Well, that's pressure to eat. You need to clean your plate before you can leave. And the child says, but I'm not hungry anymore. But the parent says, well, I really want you to eat all that broccoli. And so the child, being the good child that they are, they go ahead and they eat all that broccoli when they weren't hungry. So pressure to eat can have that other effect where you're pushing the child to have more, your own agenda of what you want your child to eat. And that child complies, and all the while is learning to ignore his internal regulator.
Disconnecting from those fullness cues.
Yeah.
And it seems like personality of the child makes a difference here, right? Like you mentioned earlier that you were the type of kid that was like, I'm a good girl, I'll do what you ask, I'm a people pleaser. And that's the type of kid I was too. And so, if my mom told me to eat more, I wouldn't even think about what my body was saying. I would just do it. And then, but I could also see how, for a more kind of defiant sort of like,
rebellious
child, that would have the opposite effect. Like, oh, you think you can tell me what to do? Let me show you how you can't. And and either way, it's disconnecting the child from what they really should be tuning into, which is, those natural cues that we're all born with, that we somehow move away from throughout these years of toddlerhood, early childhood, and then on to adulthood as well.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, there's so much now. I'll get on a little soapbox here on a little tangent. There's so much now about reteaching adults how to be intuitive eaters. And part of my purpose, I feel, on the planet is to help parents capture and hang on to what was already there when they were born. That intuition. That intuition is there, and it's these practices and the feeding style and the lack of food system and feeding structure and developmental awareness of where their child is at, that gets parents into murky waters and can oftentimes result in them, using some of these practices which completely disconnect their children from that intuition that they are born with.
Yeah, that's very well said. And I completely agree with that. I think that's so important. And I love the idea that this is not really learning something new. This is just coming back to something we already know as adults. And then and that's sort of what I see my work as primarily. And then I love bringing in the idea of parenting and raising up this new generation of little eaters who are able to connect to their bodies. And it's so much easier for a child to be able to do that when the feeding dynamics are, I love what you said about what did you say? The loving with...
Love with limits.
Love with limits. That's awesome.
Yeah.
I think it's hard to feed in this style if you are a very rigid, body image obsessed, sort of like chaotic orthorexic eater, right? I mean, it's very difficult to pass on great eating habits when you struggle yourself. And so I think it's this really important message just in general for parents to be able to do this themselves so that then they can set that example for their kids.
Right. And that's why I think that's the first step, is going back to your own roots and identifying your own experience as a child, because that informs you of your triggers, of your tendencies, what could be. And even if you're not mimicking what your parents were doing with you, if you've rejected that and adopted something else instead, that new thing might not be the most positive thing. And so really just sort of doing a deep dive and understanding where you're coming from as an individual who has had an experience as a child. What does that experience tell you? And how is that potentially playing out with your children? So that's the first step, really.
Yeah, and just one more comment about that, and then I want to hear the next step. But, sometimes as parents, I think something we do is we say, oh, my parents did it that way, and I didn't like that. So I'm going to just reject everything about the way that they did that and do the opposite. And I think it's hardly ever the right answer to do the complete 180% or 180 degree is what I meant to say, turn from your parents, maybe thinking about what were the elements that were good and what can I hold on to? What do I want to let go of? And what's right for my child? Not necessarily how can I be completely opposite of the way that my parents did it,
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. I think that it's a big circle and it's all connected. And I always like to say survey and select. No parent is 100% bad. So, and every parent I feel that I know anyways, is well-intentioned. So,
right.
Look for the pearls of wisdom, look for the positive slices. Unfortunately, kids, the literature even tells us this, that, adults tend to remember the negative stuff when it comes to their experience of feeding. But I also believe that, good solid foundations, carry through. So even though I was raised with an authoritarian feeding style, my mother had dinner on the table every night at 6:00, and she made and cooked food for us every night. And so I hold on to that because that was a good habit, and that's a habit that I want for my own family. So despite being authoritarian, she did great stuff too.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's what everybody can kind of look for from their own childhood experience.
And also for anyone who's wanting to make some different choices in their own parenting experience, so if you have been somewhat of an authoritarian or maybe a permissive parent in the past with your feeding style, maybe hold on to the things that you were doing right and let go of some of the things that you kind of feel weren't as functional or helpful for your family. And don't beat yourself up about it. The cool thing about kids is they're super resilient and forgiving, right? I mean, so there's always room for doing that with yourself, kind of like we were talking about with your own parents, is you can keep what worked and leave what didn't, but you can do that with yourself too.
Yeah, definitely.
You can change.
And I always say, childhood is a period of growth, and it's not just physical growth. Their minds are growing, their attitudes are growing, their philosophies are growing. And so there's a lot of molding that can be happening. And even though you might mess something up, there's so much room for growth from that in childhood, which is the beauty of pediatric nutrition in childhood, I think, because, nobody's ever a done deal when they're in childhood.
Exactly. And I think even parents sometimes, if this is appropriate, I've done this myself, where you make a mistake with your kids and maybe you lose your patience, and instead of just sweeping it under the rug and just moving on and not saying anything about it, sometimes I'll get down on their level and look them right in the eye and say, you know what, I'm so sorry. I just made a mistake. Even mommies make mistakes. And I think we can sometimes even do that with a feeding relationship. If you've been, saying something like, oh, sugar is so terrible, don't ever eat it. And then you realize like, oh, maybe that was doing more harm than good. I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts, Jill, but I think it's reasonable to sometimes just own up to that and say, I thought that I was doing the right thing there, but I realized that, maybe all foods can fit, and just keep it simple and age appropriate. But I think there's some space to have some simple conversations around, parents making mistakes, because they do. We all do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, it's funny because a lot of parents that I work with will tell me, okay, how do I do this? How do I do this new feeding approach? Because, I want all my parents to be authoritative in their feeding style. I want them all to have a food system, a feeding structure, and strategies that are positive and that work. And so I'm always working to get my families converted over to being more authoritative. So always the question is, okay, what do I say to my kids now? And I always say, you're going to have a family meeting, and you're going to say, listen, I've made some mistakes here. I've been doing some things wrong. Number one, I haven't been giving you a voice in things about, your food preferences. I've been being too forceful with making you clean your plate. We're going to do things differently. I'm learning how to be better, and me being better means that I'm going to be able to be better at parenting you around food. And this is how we're going to do it. And I'm getting help to do it better. So I kind of coach my families through that whole conversation so that they can sit down with their kids and basically do what you just said. Say, I've been messing this up. I didn't know how to do this. I've learned a lot. And there are some things I want to change. I want to be upfront with what's going to happen. But I also want you to be understanding that I'm learning as I go, and I'm trying to do better.
I love it. I think that that's a really powerful lesson in and of itself to teach your children, that parents make mistakes. Parents are learning as they go. Parents are able to say sorry and get collaboration and input from children. I think that's such a beautiful thing. I love that. And I'm glad that you agree that that's not a crazy idea.
No. I'm a huge fan of talking in family meetings. And I think I'm doing an okay job with my 4 kids. And I really think it goes back to all that communication and just really being connected with your kids. And that means you have to talk to them.
How old are your kids, Jill?
So my oldest is 20, and I have a 19-year-old, a 17-year-old, and a 15-year-old.
Oh my
so
goodness.
I have 2 in college and 2 in high school. And, I am not a perfect parent. I am not a perfect feeder. And we have had our ups and downs for sure. But now I have, some older children who have gone through childhood, and they're on their own, making their own decisions. And you know what? They're making really good decisions. I sit back and I'm like, I didn't have to shove this information down their throat. I didn't have to restrict them. I didn't have to pressure them. I didn't have to use a lot of rewards. Not that I never did that, but I didn't, it wasn't my go-to method. My go-to method was to be very authoritative. And I had to teach myself how to do that. I had to do a lot.
What does that mean practically?
So practically that means I had a structure with feeding my kids. We had meals and snacks at regular times and in regular spots, and I set the menu. I followed the Division of Responsibility by Ellen Satter. I learned a lot from her,
Which
but I've
we've
also
talked
done the
about on this
research.
podcast. Yeah.
Yeah, but I also dug into the research myself, and I actually had a very eye-opening experience with my first daughter, who was at a year underweight and at 18 months iron deficient. And I learned a lot from that because I was not paying attention to the food part of it. I was just paying attention to the feeding. And she was a strong-willed child and didn't want to eat and put up a lot of fuss, particularly with me when she was in the high chair. And so I was really having a hard time figuring things out. And oh, by the way, as things went, she ended up being underweight and anemic. And I woke up one day and was like, you know what? I've got to pay attention to the food and the feeding, and I need to understand what she's going through developmentally. So I just started putting those three components together, and I used it with my own children. That's how I practice. Fearless feeding was born out of that. So it's not just feeding. I feel strongly about the fact that parents need to also be aware of food and nutrition. And in our society today, you just can't not be aware. I think you have to be, I encourage my families that I work with to be very flexible and fearless with food. But I know that in order to be flexible and fearless, you have to be informed, and you need to have credible, science-based evidence, not the crazy stuff that's out there right now, but really just balance and helping each family strike a balance with food and have a system that they feel good about, that's good for their children. So I learned it for myself. I teach it to my clients, and it's working out pretty well, I think. And my children, now that I said that they're older, they're flexible with food. They're going to have dessert when they want dessert, but they also will eat a very healthy have a day of just nutritious foods all day long. They'll work out. They get good sleep. I mean, they're really just well balanced.
Well, good for you. That's awesome. That says a lot. And it's one thing for someone like me who has young kids to talk about this. It's another to hear someone so much farther down the road and to be able to see some of the consequences or fruits of your efforts sort of in the way that your kids approach food. So that's just really awesome, and it's so fun to hear. One of my, I don't know if fear is the right word, but just kind of like angst. I have some angst about this because I've tried my very best to create this home very similarly to what you're saying of, lots of structure around food, but lots of flexibility and lots of autonomy with my kids being able to decide if they eat and how much and things like that. And no body shaming talk in our house, no dieting talk. We're just very kind of, it's almost not body positive. It's more just like neutral. Like we just
body neutral.
Yeah. Like we're not like obsessing about the way our bodies look. Right.
Right.
So, I have two little girls who I think just have the most amazing everything about them. I love them, but their little bodies and the way they eat, they have great appetites. They eat lots of good food, and they're so pure still. They don't have any real influence of good and bad and right and wrong in terms of food and the way bodies look, and they just don't have those messages in their head yet. And I know that there will come a day when I will have to face, some comments about bodies or something like that and weight, and it kind of freaks me out a little. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about, what your ideas are about how to approach conversations about weight with your kids. What do you have in mind offhand? And then I'll ask some follow-up questions.
Sure. So a long, long time ago in my practice, and when I was a younger mother, one of the questions that I would hear a lot would be from parents who were really upset that their child had asked them, "Do you think I'm fat?" And for some reason, this was back in, 2008, 2008, 2009, it was coming up a lot in my practice. And I had a really good friend who was a therapist. And my response to that was, if your child says, "Do you think I'm fat?" No, I don't think you're fat. I think you're perfect. And I love you just the way you are. And I especially love, how loyal you are to your friends and how creative you are and how responsible you are with making your bed. Just highlight all the positive things about the child that's not related to their body or their weight. But I talked to my therapist friend because I had a client whose daughter kept asking the question, "Do you think I'm fat?" And I said, I sought counsel from this therapist because my thought was that this child was feeling insecure. This was beyond just reassure me that you love me. It was more than that. And the therapist advised me, and I thought it was really good advice, and I ended up writing a blog post about it called "Do You Think I'm Fat?" And the therapist had said, always, no matter the topic, if a child brings up the topic more than once, it's generally an indication that there's something going on and that you need to sit down and have a conversation with that child. And so I've always sort of counseled my parents along those lines. First time, only question. It's generally the child is looking for reassurance that you love them no matter what. And that's the most important point to make to a child anytime they are, seemingly unsure of themselves. But then if it's a persistent question, I think that you have to have a conversation and find out what's going on. I think maybe the child is bullied. Maybe the child is having a low self-esteem. Maybe the child is feeling ignored. But usually when they're asking more than once, it's a sign that you probably need to sit down and just have a conversation, more out of curiosity, not a lecture to tell the child they are, they shouldn't be worrying about stuff like that, but more out of just, where's this coming from? Tell me what makes you think that.
You never know what's behind it.
Exactly.
You know what? That is so funny that you bring that particular question up. And one thing that my oldest asked me yesterday, I was laying in the hammock with her, and she said, "Mom, you're fat." I was like, "Oh, okay. What makes you say that?" She said that my breasts are fat, So she was like, "Well, look right there." And I was like, "Oh, okay, yeah, I can see what you're talking about." And I was like, "Well, that's just kind of the way that girls' bodies are when they're older, and and even if I were fat, that would be okay because we all have different bodies, and some people are tall, some people are short, some people are bigger, some people are smaller, and we like people who are different than us, and that's okay. We can all just have the bodies that we have when we eat food and take care of ourselves." And she seemed to be satisfied with that answer, but that's sort of one of my go-tos is just normalizing differences, right? And just saying like we're going to be pointing out like, oh, her skin is that color and her skin is that color and his body looks like that and his body looks like that. Kids are going to do that. And I think the more we say, shh, don't talk about that, or like, oh no, that hurts someone's feelings, I think it creates more secretiveness around it and less openness and confusion. And so I just try to sort of say, hey, that's okay. We all have different bodies. And, by the way, mommies have, different shaped bodies than you do. And that's okay too. So I don't know. What are your thoughts about sort of those questions about, because sometimes I think the question of, am I fat, is sort of trying to understand like what's okay and what's not. And to be honest, I think fat phobia and all of this obsession we have these days about body size is really, I think, easy to absorb even at a very young age. And I like to just kind of help my kids understand that everybody has different shaped bodies, and that's okay.
Hmm. Well, I think I have a couple of thoughts about that. I think for your listeners, it's important to understand that children, particularly as they get into the school age years, they look for differences. That's how they figure out who they are. They are very aware of differences and want to talk about them and point them out. And so that awareness of body shape, weight, or size difference is very normal, because they're, like you said, they're also noticing that somebody has curly hair and somebody has straight hair and somebody has darker skin and somebody has lighter skin and somebody's short and somebody's tall. So kids in the school years are very attuned to differences, and that's how they identify themselves as who they are. Are they normal or are they really different? And that's just a normal part of growing up. That's a normal part of the developmental process. I think the other point I wanted to just comment on is developing tolerance is something that's taught. You know, kids are really open and they're really accepting and tolerant when they're young. I mean, you see it in preschool and toddlers. They're happy, they're not judgmental, they're not critical. They learn that stuff. So I would encourage, you know, everybody out there who's a parent to really, you know, it's not just we want to teach tolerance to ethnic diversity or social diversity. We want to teach tolerance of all diversity, and not just body diversity, but all diversity, food preference diversity, food philosophy diversity. I mean, I think, to me, I always say to my families that I work with, nutrition's very personal. It is not my place to judge your nutrition and food choice. But if you're wanting help and guidance in certain areas, that's where I can help. So I think teaching tolerance is really sort of the crux of, you know, helping kids understand diversity in any shape, weight, or form. It's related to teaching them to be tolerable of all kinds of differences. And then it's a normal conversation. It's not a loaded conversation about somebody's weight. It's just a normal conversation that you're having about any topic related to differences.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that what you said about developmentally it being very normal for a child to recognize and articulate differences in others that they see, I also think it's good to sort of establish that train of thought, that the next thought you have is, great, I'm so glad that people are different, and that's okay. And so that's kind of what you're talking about there, is that tolerance. They're going to notice it, and then the parent's job is maybe to model the fact that we love that. We love that everybody's different, and that's so fun, and that's what makes life really interesting and enjoyable, is just all the different people. So.
Yeah, that's the spice of life.
Totally, yeah.
I always say to my kids, I've always said to my kids, you know, people will like you for the way your brain thinks, and your brain and the differences that you have about who you are. That's what attracts people. Not your sameness. It's your difference.
That's so true. I know how many people listening who are married to someone exactly like them. You know, I know for me, my husband is like polar opposite of me personality wise. I'm super extroverted and could talk to anyone, and he's kind of shy, you know? So yeah, I think that is what kind of attracts us to each other is saying, oh, I don't recognize that. Interesting. That's so different than the way that it works for me.
Right.
Well, okay, yeah. So conversations about weight and body shape and size are going to come up developmentally. It's very normal for kids to recognize differences in their peers and in people that they come across. And sort of what I'm hearing from you is, I love the idea of if it comes up once, they're looking for reassurance, and if it comes up more than that, maybe just asking a lot of questions and being open to having a conversation. Maybe stop what you're doing and find out what's behind that, and do your best to help them with whatever maybe brought that on by asking questions and being supportive. And, you know, again, I think this conversation comes back to parents need to do their own work with if they struggle with really not being happy or content with their own body, maybe doing their own work to try to develop at least some neutrality around that so that they can model that for their children. And just like we talked about earlier with the feeding styles, right? It's crucial to kind of do your best to make peace with your own situations with food and body image and weight and all of that, to be able to model that for your kids.
Right. And just pay attention to your reactions. I think sometimes we're moving so fast all the time, and we hear these things our kids say, and we're like, we get angry, or we freak out, or we panic, and we think automatic it's like some pathological situation that's starting to unravel and unfold. And I think that if you have any kind of gut reaction to something like that, there's something behind there, that you've been triggered in some way, shape, or form, and that's worth exploring within yourself, too.
Great point. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think we know that there's just so much, and this is more your area than it is my area, but we do know that. From a feeding standpoint anyways, mothers who have struggled with their own body weight, who have struggled with their own body image, are going to be more likely to be controlling in their feeding. They are going to be more likely to restrict or to reward or to pressure, because they've got their own history of body image and weight concerns. So that's something that, is worth exploring for parents who might be struggling in that area with feeding their children. Like where, how is their own feeling about themselves and their own history of feeding as a child, being a child who was fed, how does that relate to how they're working with their child and feeding them now?
Yeah, that's such an important point, and a good way to kind of tie in what we talked about in the beginning and then what we were just talking about is, that idea of really being introspective in your own history and your story as a parent, and then also being open to the idea that you can change and you can learn new things, and nothing's ever set in stone. We're always evolving, and it's okay to own up to that and take a different path, because I don't care who you are. If you're a parent, you've done that. We're constantly trying to grow and change and become better, because that's just what life is. And so there's no shame in that.
Right. And I oftentimes, just as a side note, a lot of times my families will say, will you tell my child how to eat right? Or will you tell my child this? And they need to hear it from you. And I often step back and say, no, you know what? I actually want to work with you, the parents. I want to get you rocking your household and rocking that connection with your child and rocking dinners and all meals. And I just, your child will completely, if you've got your stuff together, your child will just fall in line. It's not your child's problem. And I'm not saying it's the parent's problem either, because I have a huge amount of compassion for parents there. They enter the job of parenthood in terms of food and nutrition with no education. I mean, we don't do that to teenagers when they drive. They take big course, they get their license, and off they go. Well, parents, we just, they get inserted into the role of feeder and nourisher without any background, no information, and they're just winging it. So I have a lot of compassion for parents. But what I often do is I focus and hone in on the parent, because I know that if I can help them with their, food feeding and understanding development, that they'll start rocking it and the child will just fall right in line. You don't even have to focus on the child so much. You have to focus on the family.
Right. And in fact,
rental unit.
The more you focus on the child, the more problematic it tends to become, right? Exactly. It doesn't really lead to good things to do that.
Exactly. Yep.
I know. Right. Parenting is intense.
It is intense. Yeah. But what do they say? Nothing easy is ever really all that worthwhile.
Yeah,
or something like that. I don't know what they say.
But I know what you mean, and it's just like the highest highs and the lowest lows. It's a trip, but man, it'll definitely outline and highlight what you need to work on. And so this is just an example of that, of sort of amplify. That's what parenting is. I think it's just this amplification of where you our week where you can improve. And sometimes food and feeding and nutrition and body image can be one of those things. And there's no shame in that. That's okay. So Jill, thank you so much for talking with me about this. Let's just take a quick minute to tell everybody how they can keep in touch with you, and be sure to mention your podcast and your blog and all of that.
Okay. Well, everything is over on my website, jillcastle.com. And I do have a blog and a podcast called The Nourished Child. And we have a little Facebook page too, so you can connect with me over there. And I have a newsletter that goes out every Monday if people want to jump on that. I talk about all kinds of topics in childhood nutrition, from food topics to feeding topics to development to sports nutrition, all kinds of stuff. And I have a few courses for parents and
some
books and guides, on my website. And all good stuff, all geared towards helping parents be, the best feeders and home front nutrition experts they can be for their children.
That's great, Jill. Thank you so much again for being here and for all of your work in this area. It's so important, and I'm so glad that you could come on the podcast. I hope lots of people go over and listen to yours. I know I do get a bunch of questions about the whole parenting, feeding thing. So I'm glad we took some time to talk about that today. And I hope everyone heads on over and checks out your stuff, because it's a lot of really, really good stuff. So thanks again, Jill, for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Paige.
Well, I sincerely hope you've enjoyed this conversation. If you haven't already, please go ahead and leave a review on iTunes. Thanks again so much for listening, and we'll see you soon for another episode.